You know, I tell my students it's sort of like spreading your literary wings in a phone booth.
University of Oregon news editing professor John Rushell is talking about headline writing.
That's not an easy job in 5 words.
Every day, most people read them, those few words that sum up an entire story.
One of the things I tell my students is you can't write a headline without reading the whole story.
But that's often what people do.
They're extremely important because in many cases a headline is all that a reader sees.
So how can headlines shape your perceptions of a war?
Confidently presses on, warily fights forward.
Professor Rushell is looking at 2 Oregon papers with entirely different headlines atop the exact same story. The March 31st headline in the Oregonian reads, U.S. confidently presses on. The Register Guard's headline from the same day says, U.S. warily fights forward.
Maybe it's the U.S. command is confident. Maybe the U.S. troops are wary. It's hard to say unless you read the story.
The Register Guard and the Oregonian both declined our invitation to visit with us about this story. They wouldn't go into detail as to why they didn't want to talk, only to say they were not interested.
While differences can be found between U.S. newspaper headlines, a completely opposite worldview can be taken from the headlines of some papers overseas. The headline in today's London Daily Telegraph reads, Fall of Saddam not worth one life.
I think newspapers from different countries kind of take their country's view.
The March 30th issue of Ireland's Sunday Independent reads, Poll reveals 2-1 against war, 75% anti-Bush.
I think the interesting issue is would this story run in an American newspaper?
March for peace, march toward war.
U of O visiting associate professor David Coranda says papers take the view of their readership, all in the name of the bottom line.
I think it has to do with marketing. I think it has to do with we're marketing our papers. We're marketing our papers to who is in our market and who's most likely to buy them. So our headlines will reflect that toward a sale.
Coranda teaches advertising, and when he compares the Oregonian to the Register Guard, he looks to see how the papers market themselves.
I think that the Oregonian overall is targeting a more conservative attitude.
He refers to constant headline photos of U.S. troops in the Oregonian, compared to the more commonly seen above-the-fold pictures of Iraqi citizens in the Register Guard.
They're more human-oriented, they're more people-oriented, and maybe that appeals to this market better.
I actually think that that's pretty much a misconception.
Professor Rushell, who once wrote headlines for a living, says papers don't write them thinking about how much money they'll bring in, since most papers don't make their money off one day's printed edition.
A grabber headline, may sell in a tabloid in, say, a big eastern city, because people are walking past the newsstand and buying it on the street based on the headline.
In places like Eugene, newspaper boxes aren't the moneymakers, it's subscriptions.
There's no reason to try to grab someone by the throat and hype a story in a headline in that case.
But Professor Coranda says the wall between news and advertising is so thin that headline writers may not even know they're marketing.
It's a deep part of the culture. So it's being reflected, I think, in the way the news is being delivered.
In Eugene, Melika Johnson, 9 News.